Hey everybody, welcome back to Historical-ish. This is episode 3 of the Ancient Mysteries Iceberg, in which I walk through tier by tier these ancient mysteries. If you're new to the channel, go down to the description below and there'll be a link to the first episode. And if you enjoy these videos, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can follow along when new episodes come out. Anyways, let's get right into it. Number 1, Cambyses' Lost Army. So in 525 BC, Persian Emperor Cambyses II, who was son of Cyrus the Great, invaded Egypt and defeated Pharaoh Psamtik III. Once defeated, Cambyses looked to the Oracle of Amun to solidify his rule, which they were unable to give him any legitimacy over the Kingdom of Egypt. So in retaliation in 524 BC, Cambyses then sent out an army of around 50,000 men to attack the temple which held the oracle, which is now in modern-day Siwa, Egypt. While Cambyses went south to Ethiopia to continue his campaign, the army of 50,000 men headed to the temple and within 7 days apparently got caught in a massive sandstorm, which they proceeded to disappear within, never to be seen again. Herodotus writes, "A wind arose from the south, strong and deadly, bringing with it vast columns of whirling sand, which entirely covered up the troops and caused them to wholly disappear." I will note that this story is written by Herodotus, who is known to not be the most accurate of historians. He often embellishes or completely makes up parts of his works, so this wasn't even documented within the Egyptian or Persian records, so who knows if it actually even happened. There have been some expeditions to try to find the lost army with no real results to show for it. One claim in 2009 was proven to be a hoax, and one claim in 2011 wasn't authorized by the government and seems to lead to another hoax. Although it is likely to be a fictional story, some interesting theories include the army being picked off by mercenaries, getting lost in the desert, or even the story just being true, all of which would have caused Darius, the successor of Cambyses, to feel the need to erase this embarrassing story from their record. Number 2, Etruscan Civilization and its origin. So the Etruscan Civilization was at its height from the 8th century BC to the 5th century BC and was located in the Etrurian region in Italy. To the Greeks, they were known as the Tyrrhenians, and due to their different languages, they had many questions about the origins of the Etruscans, which still haven't been answered today. Herodotus theorized that they came from Lydia in Asia Minor, fleeing from a famine at the time, but this theory is doubted due to the different language and cultural structures found in both civilizations, and also it was written by Herodotus. The three main modern theories are that they came from either Asia Minor during the Late Bronze Age, traveled over the Alps from the north, or evolved locally with significant influence from the east rather than the west. There have been some DNA studies to bodies that have been found, which notes that they have more DNA similarities to the peoples north of the Alps, which seems to be the most likely explanation for where they came from. Number 3, helicopter hieroglyphs. This is actually a pretty interesting grouping of hieroglyphs found in Egypt with what looks to be a depiction of a helicopter, boat, submarine, and maybe even a UFO, depending on how you look at it. Obviously, this is way ahead of the time period in which these hieroglyphs would have been carved, which leads to some pretty crazy theories about Egyptians being visited by time travelers or even extraterrestrials. Although this is always fun to think about, it is highly unlikely that these theories hold any merit, with leading archaeologists believing that this is a common case of pareidolia, which is just when the brain perceives patterns or meanings when there really isn't any there. It is common in ancient Egypt for old or deteriorating hieroglyphs to be recarved or carved over, which could have led to what we see now as these mysterious markings. Some researchers believe that the original carvings were made under Seti I and then recarved under Ramses II, which is still long before helicopters even existed. I definitely think that the extraterrestrial theory is more fun and definitely goes along with the theme of the Egyptians gaining some mystical powers from some unknown beings. Number 4, the Plague of Athens. In Athens in 430 BC, an epidemic swept through the city and killed tens of thousands of people, which was nearly a third of its population at the time. But to this day, nobody knows the actual cause of this infamous plague. A year earlier, the Spartans and Athenians began a war between each other, with the Spartans making attacks on land while the Athenians focused mainly on naval warfare. One theory at the time was that the attacking Spartans poisoned the water sources, which caused the entire city to get sick, which was exacerbated by the fact that pretty much all Athenians in the region came within the city walls for protection against the Spartans and were in close proximity with one another. Another theory by Thucydides, who actually lived through the plague, states that it came up from Ethiopia, moved north through Egypt, and then finally reaching Greece. He describes the disease as starting with inflammation of the eyes and throat, moving to the lungs, causing hoarseness and coughing, and finally the stomach, which caused vomiting and violent spasms. He even describes people claiming to feel as if they were on fire from the inside with an unquenchable thirst. He also notes that most people would dunk themselves in water for extended periods of time to try to find some relief. He also notes that most victims did die within 7 to 9 days. This caused immense civil unrest in the region due to the amount of uncertainty about the disease as bodies piled up everywhere along the streets. According to Thucydides at the time, the Oracle of Delphi predicted the epidemic, with the god Apollo aligning with Sparta and promising a victory over Athens. The plague ended 5 years later with around 75 to 100,000 people dead. The Spartans would go on to victory years later in 405 BC over the Athenians. A mass grave was found which dates back to the time period, with DNA having a match to typhoid fever, but this is often refuted as the disease was common during the time. Some researchers believe it points to Ebola, but I'm sure we'll never actually know what disease it was in particular. Number 5. Shrunken Heads. So everyone's pretty much seen the pictures of the shrunken heads that native tribes have, and there's a lot of mystery that has come out of Hollywood recently about these artifacts. These shrunken heads are more formally known as sansas, and the most well-known come out of Peru and Ecuador, as the tribes in the areas had many different reasons for this practice. After a battle with another tribe, the victors would remove the skull, facial muscles, and the brains, and then sew the eyes and mouth shut, and then through a series of boiling the skin and filling it with hot stones from the inside, it allowed for the head to shrink to about a third of its original size. Once the skin dried, it would allow it to be preserved until what we have today. The reasons for this being that the enemies that were defeated, the victors believed that their spirits would be trapped within the head, and the victor could harness the spirit's power for themselves, showing the true victory over the enemy. Oddly enough, in the 1850s, Europeans had gotten this weird fascination with these shrunken heads, and the Amazonian locals began to produce these heads without any ceremonial value and strictly for trade. This hype around the shrunken head fascination caused a lot of forgeries and fakes to be made, usually using sloth heads, which I guess is better, but yeah. Number 6, the Villa of Mysteries. This is a well-preserved Roman villa outside the town of Pompeii, and during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, the villa, along with the rest of the city, was covered in a thick layer of ash that allowed for the preservation of the mysterious frescoes that are found on its walls. Originally constructed as a lavish villa, an earthquake in 62 AD caused it to fall into disrepair and began to be renovated into a more agriculture or winemaking villa, with actual winemaking presses being found within. Also within the villa, there is a statue of Livia, wife of Augustus, which does lead some archaeologists to believe that this was owned by her. Within one of the many rooms, there are a series of frescoes that is what the core of the mystery is here. The most common interpretation is the idea that they depict the initiation rites of a young girl into the mysterious cult of Dionysus, or as the Romans knew him, Bacchus. The frescoes are meant to be read as a single narrative, with some scholars believing the room itself was used to initiate women into the cult. This mystery cult was known to use different intoxicants to induce a trance-like state, in the goal to return to a more natural state. Obviously, since this was a mystery cult with only initiates knowing the practices, it began to fade away with the decline of Greco-Roman polytheism, and we don't know much more about it today. Number 7. Why do so many mythologies have flood myths? One of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world is that almost every religion on Earth, past and present, has a flood story. This is an event where the entire world is essentially wiped out by a massive flood that is only survived by a small group of individuals with the task of repopulating the planet. Now, these stories do vary from religion to religion, but the general principle is the same. The most common known flood story is in the Abrahamic religions, with Noah being commanded by God to build the ark, where then God sent down torrential rains that cover the earth. Only Noah and his family were saved, along with 2 of every animal on earth. In ancient Mesopotamia, the flood story is detailed in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where after the death of a friend, Gilgamesh, who goes to search for immortality, meets a man who is very similar to the character of Noah. He tells a tale of getting his relatives on a boat, as well as 2 of every living animal, and begin to repopulate the earth after the flood. Even the Aztec story bears some slight resemblance with the story of Noah, with a god commanding a couple to get in a canoe where they are sealed inside. They are told that they can only eat 1 ear of maize, but after the rest of humanity are turned into fish, they disobey their god and eat the fish. This does result in them getting turned into dogs, which is a little bit different, but this forces humanity to restart from square one. The Greeks also had a flood story similar to Noah, except that instead of humans being saved by an ark, it was the gods, after which the gods threw stones down onto Earth, which turned into humans and began to repopulate the Earth. I could go into every culture that has a flood story, but there are hundreds. What's really interesting here is that across the whole Earth, there is the story of the flood, which isn't to say that it's not true, but there has to be an underlying reason as to why each culture would write about such a specific thing. My favorite theory about this is one that I've talked about previously, which is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which states that around 12,600 years ago, a comet hit Earth and caused a massive flooding event across the globe. Essentially, the comet hitting the Earth would have caused a huge heat blast that would have melted the North Atlantic glaciers immediately and caused sea levels to rise over 400 feet. Most cultures at the time did seem to reside near the coast, and would have caused an event in history across the globe that would have been seared into the collective memories of humans, but told in different flavors across the different cultures and regions. Number 8, the Phaistos Disc. This was a disc discovered in 1908 from the Minoan Palace of Phaistos. It's made from fired clay and is dated to the late Minoan Bronze Age in the 2nd millennium BC. As you can see, it's covered on both sides with spiraled symbols, and its purpose and location of origination is disputed. There are 45 distinct symbols within it, and it's almost impossible to decipher, as these are the only times in which these symbols have been found. And since this is the only object with these symbols on it, no meaningful analysis can be done. Although 2 researchers believe the artifact to be a forgery, a later discovery of an axe with similar but not identical glyphs seemed to point to the fact that it is authentic. There's a wide variety of theories about what it was used for, some being for prayers, a story, a board game, or even a geometric theorem, but there's no way of proving any of these as they are all considered pseudo-archaeology. Because it has no resemblance to Linear A or Linear B, some scholars believe it is not of Minoan origin, but somewhere else in the Aegean, with claims that it has more similarities to Anatolian hieroglyphs. There is a vast list of different claims to have decoded it, but since it is a one-of-a-kind with no similar artifacts being found, it is almost impossible to say one of them is even close to correct. Number 9, ever-burning lamps. This is a pretty broad phenomenon that has been recorded throughout ancient history, although there have been no modern cases of ever-burning lamps today. As the name suggests, these are just lamps that burn for a significant amount of time longer than what they were supposed to, often for hundreds of years. These stories come from all around the world, from Asia, the Americas, but most specifically Greece, Italy, England, and France. Some notable examples of ever-burning lamps mostly include tombs, such as the Tomb of Pallas, which in 140 CE, the Tomb of Pallas was opened in Italy and was found to have a lamp within it that was still burning. It is claimed that neither blowing on or using water would extinguish the flames, with talks about some mysterious liquid within the lamp. Another notable tomb is the tomb of Constantius Chlorus, who died in 300 CE, but after King Henry VIII separated from the Catholic Church and ordered the destruction of Catholic churches and communities, this tomb was opened with a still burning lamp within. Now, most all of the stories happen like this, so there's no need to dive into all of them, and since no modern examples have been found, most believe these stories to be fabrications. Although, some modern theorists do believe that these could be accounts of early forms of electricity or even alchemy in which they created ever-burning liquids. Number 10, the Indus Script. Indus Script, or Harappan script, is a collection of symbols, often very short, produced by the Indus Valley Civilization. The average length of symbols is 5, with the largest being 34 characters long, and there are over 4,000 inscribed objects with over 400 unique symbols, but still no way of reading a single bit of it. Some scholars have linked it to the Brahmi script found in South Asia, or the Dravidian languages spoken in the southern tip of India. This is yet another undecipherable language due to there being no bilingual inscription to help decipher it, and since these inscriptions are so short, it is very difficult to tell if this is even a language at all, especially since the syntax and forms of it were largely unchanged over time. Well, that about wraps it up for today's episode. If there are any topics covered in this video or any of the previous videos that you want me to dive deeper into, please leave a comment down in the comment sections below and I can do a single video on one of those. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed watching this video, but at the very least, thanks for watching.